Hi there. So we're back for our last live lecture of the day. We're going to be talking right now about the Emily Bazelon article, "Billionaires versus the Press in the Age of Trump." And look, it's a pretty straightforward article, but there are a couple things I want to expand on here that she brings up. Uh, and the first is what are called anti-SLAPP laws. So Bazelon talks about these, but doesn't really tell us what they are. So let's talk about these anti-SLAPP laws. So SLAPP is an acronym. It's for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Policy or against public participation. And the idea is that if a lawsuit is brought just to shut down public debate on something. So like the Peter Thiel lawsuits we were talking about before, right? You're a billionaire, you say, I want to sue this company and get rid of them. Well, if you're a public figure, and you're probably not going to win anyway, because of New York Times v. Sullivan, the actual malice standard for public figures to actually win a libel lawsuit is very difficult. So it's hard for them to win. But as the article points out, it is relatively easy to, if you've got very deep pockets, you can spend $100 million on a lawsuit or $50 million on a lawsuit. The idea is you're going to spend the money in the lawsuit and then force the other side to spend money as well. And even if you wind up you spend $50 million, they spend $5 million. Well, if $5 million will put a newspaper out of business or a website out of business, well, congratulations, you won, right? Even though your lawsuit might not be merit, you might wind up losing, you still come out ahead because you got rid of them. You were able to take revenge on them. And the big issue here isn't necessarily that you take revenge on them, haha, they know better than doing it again, but rather that everybody else knows that, okay, well, don't write anything bad about this guy because he's going to sue you and he's going to put you out of business. Even if you win, you're still going to go out of business. So anti-SLAPP laws are put in place by states, not at the federal level yet, but put in place by states in order to prevent this kind of lawsuit. So the idea is that if you think you're being sued by a public figure for political participation, then what you can do is file an anti-SLAPP motion in court. And if the judge agrees with you, the lawsuit against you gets thrown out. But not only that, the people who brought the lawsuit in the first place, they have to then pay your fees. So they have to pay for your lawyers. So you essentially don't lose anything out of pocket. So if you spend $1 million defending yourself before you even go to trial, the lawsuit gets thrown out, then the other side has to give you $1 million. So you're not actually worse off for having had to defend yourselves. Now, it doesn't happen a lot because it's very hard to prove that this is just a lawsuit filed as a nuisance, but it is supposedly a way to try and make sure that we don't get these sort of lawsuits. Now, it actually doesn't work that effectively because it's on a state basis. And especially in the modern era, almost any media outlet, especially websites, are going to operate in every state at the same time. As a result, in anti-SLAPP lawsuit, if I'm suing you for no good reason, from Peter Thiel or whoever is suing you for no good reason, what I can do is I can actually file the lawsuit in a state that doesn't have anti-SLAPP laws, and as a result, avoid all of it. All right, so that's the anti-SLAPP laws. I think they're now in 28 different states in the District of Columbia. And they can be effective, but it's relatively easy to get around them. And it relies on the idea that you'd never actually go to trial, right? Once you go to trial, it's not going to work. You have to do it, and you have to win on the SLAPP motion before you actually go to trial. Basically, when the case first gets brought, you're going to move for dismissal right then, and for the anti-SLAPP to come into effect. All right, let's talk a little bit about Peter Thiel, right? So Peter Thiel is kind of the villain of this piece, and he winds up being a villain in a lot of pieces. He is a tech billionaire. He was the CEO of PayPal and took PayPal public and made billions of dollars off of that, as well as the CEO of right now probably a more sinister seeming company, a company called Palantir. Palantir is, if you read The Lord of the Rings, they're the Seeing Stones. The idea is this is actually a company that works with the government on surveillance. So it's a company that's monitoring internet traffic and emails and all that to help the government surveil people. And so Peter Thiel is a hardcore libertarian and a big donor to Republican and conservative causes, especially libertarian causes. If you're not aware, so libertarian means that essentially he thinks the government should be smaller and do less and keep the government out of everyone's business, especially his own business. So what happened with Peter Thiel in the Gawker case was that Gawker wrote an article essentially outing him, saying that he was homosexual. As far as we know, he is in fact homosexual. He was upset about this, but he didn't sue them directly because if he'd done that, he thought it would look bad. So he instead funded a whole bunch of other lawsuits against them, including a lawsuit filed by Hulk Hogan, the 1980s professional wrestler, against Gawker because Gawker had shown part of a sex tape between Hulk Hogan, and there's a whole thing with there's another wrestler, the other wrestler having sex with his wife, and you're happier not knowing about it. The bottom line is that Hulk Hogan, well, Peter Thiel didn't really have a case against Gawker because Peter Thiel is a figure of public concern. They hadn't written anything that was untrue. So if Peter Thiel wanted to sue Gawker, he would have to prove that they wrote an article saying he was gay. He would have to prove that he was not in fact gay, and that they had written that he was gay while knowing that he wasn't in fact gay. And none of those things are true. So Peter Thiel himself could not have won the case against Gawker. So what he did is he found other plaintiffs who could have. We talked about this before, the idea of plaintiff shopping or forum shopping. The idea if I don't have a good lawsuit right away, what I can do is I find someone else who has a good lawsuit, and I'm going to fund theirs. This is used oftentimes by groups like the NAACP in the 1950s, right? They sought out plaintiffs. So Brown v. Board of Education, the most famous segregation case, that's the case where the Supreme Court desegregated American schools on the basis of race. Well, they had the NAACP searched around for a plaintiff that they thought that could bring that cause. So this is a common strategy, but in this case, it's not to try and make a constitutional point, not trying to challenge a law. Peter Thiel is using to try and bring down a company, and he was successful. So Peter Thiel, this is thought to have what's called a chilling effect on media. Chilling effect meaning that the media sources go, well, okay, we're just not going to write Peter Thiel. We don't care what he does. We write anything, he's going to take us down. We can't afford to defend ourselves against lawsuits, so we're just not going to do anything. However, while cases like Peter Thiel's, and there's other venture capitalists, other very wealthy people who've done this, the bigger problem for the media has actually been private equity. So private equity simply means you're a company that has, all you do is invest in things. You've got a lot of money, you pool money from a lot of investors, and you take that and you buy other companies. So you might have heard of some guys in private equity. So for instance, some of the wealthiest people in America, the guy who owns Geico, there's a lot of very, very wealthy people who are very successful, not necessarily bad, who run private equity firms, who buy up companies they think could be more profitable. They buy up the company and then they make it more profitable and they make a lot of money off of it. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. The problem with private equity comes when private equity turns into what's called vulture capitalism. So vulture capitalism simply means that private equity buys up a company that they feel is undervalued. And they don't do it in order to try and turn the company around, invest in it, and make it more profitable. Rather, what they do is they invest in the company. They buy the company in order to sell it off, in order to get any value that's left in the company, then sell off the assets and make a profit off of that. So if there's a company that I can buy for $100 million, I know it's got $50 million worth of assets. What I do is I buy it for $100 million and I go into debt to buy it. Then I take that $100 million that I used to buy it and I move that debt that I acquired back into the company. So now the company has a $100 million debt, this crushing debt that it can't afford to pay. But in the meantime, I, as the vulture capitalist, not venture capitalist, vulture capitalist, I, as the vulture capitalist, I don't have any liability anymore. So now what I can do, I've moved all that debt back to the company, and now I can actually sell off the assets of that company one by one. And I will, if they had $50 million of assets, I pocket $50 million. And I didn't lose anything. I just had to have $100 million in the first place, or ability to borrow $100 million so I could buy the company. So this sort of private equity move is destructive, right? You take a company that is in fact profitable and you destroy it by loading it up with debt and then selling off the assets. Even if you're not aware of how this works with media companies, you certainly are aware of Toys R Us, right? This is what happened to Toys R Us. It got bought up by a huge company. Now, Toys R Us was a profitable company. People buy toys and video games and bikes. There was a profitable company making plenty of money. But then after it was bought by venture capitalists, they loaded all the debt, the billions of dollars of debt that it took to buy Toys R Us back onto the company. And then the company couldn't afford to make those debt payments, defaulted, went bankrupt. Thousands of people lost their jobs. The people who own the private equity company, however, made a lot of money, right? Because they just were able to sell off the assets that Toys R Us had. And basically said vulture capitalism, they're going in, they're picking out the remains. This has been the biggest problem for media companies, especially for newspapers. Newspapers are not nearly as profitable as they used to be. If we go back even as recently as about 20 years ago, when I was working in newspapers, newspapers were very profitable. They had lots of ads, right? It was the best way it was thought to reach ads. You had TV ads, you had newspaper ads. And so if you're a company there, you would advertise in the newspaper. They also have what are called classified ads. Classified ads meaning individual people taking out ads, oftentimes to buy or sell something. You found a dog, you lost your dog, or Putting out a personal ad, you're looking for a date. You would buy small ads in the back of the newspaper, and you'd pay by the letter for those ads. So even if you're only paying $5 or $15 for your ad, well, guess what? If I've got a newspaper, I've got 5 or 6 pages full of those ads, I'm pocketing a lot of money every single day. So newspapers recently, as about 20 years ago, were incredibly profitable. They made a lot of money. But Craigslist and online dating sites got rid of all of the classified ads. The display ads for big companies, a lot of those moved to online, moved to Google essentially. Google is now the world's largest advertising company. So as a result, all that revenue for newspapers dried up. And so newspapers are still profitable, but not as profitable as they used to be. And this made them vulnerable to vulture capitalist takeovers. Why? Well, newspapers also have lots of assets. They've got a subscriber base, right? People are paying to buy the newspaper. And if you invest less in the newspaper, you fire reporters, you don't put as much effort into it, well, those people are going to stick around. So you've got continuing revenue streams coming in, even if you fire a bunch of the people working at the newspaper. Newspapers often, especially in cities, have really big buildings, right? They have big buildings, they have big printing presses, they have all these things that are assets that in theory you could sell off and make a lot of money. So they become very attractive targets for vulture capitalists. And we've seen is a lot of previously great newspapers have had vulture capitalists come in, private equity take over, fire half the reporters or 2/3 of the reporters, and still continue making a little bit of money off it while selling off the assets. So this has been the real threat. So we've seen, for instance, one of the great newspapers of America not too long ago was the Cleveland Plain Dealer, right? The main newspaper in a pretty big city of Cleveland. As recently as about 10 years ago, they had 300 reporters covering what was going on in Cleveland. Today, they got bought up by private equity, and as a result, they now have 14 reporters to cover all of Cleveland. Right? They're not doing their job anymore. They can't do it because they don't have the people. They don't have the people because they have to do more and with less and less and less input, because the people who own the newspaper, the venture capitalists who own it, don't really care about making money or don't really care about providing news. They're just trying to extract as much wealth from the newspaper as they can before they shut it down and just sell everything off. So this is really the big issue. Now, this can be taken to an extreme. So we've got vulture capitalists who are buying up newspapers and media outlets and just selling them off for parts. But in other cases, when they buy them, they're going to buy them and then silence them in order to just get rid of them. So you're Peter Thiel. Okay, you don't like that someone wrote an article about you. You don't like that BuzzFeed or in this case Gawker wrote an article about you. Well, if you've got enough money, it actually turns out you might, instead of suing them out of existence, you could just buy them. And this is what we saw happen in Las Vegas. The biggest newspaper in Las Vegas did a lot of reports on a gambling magnate named Sheldon Adelson. So Sheldon Adelson responded by using a bunch of shell companies to buy the biggest newspaper in Las Vegas and tell them basically, can't report on me anymore because I own you now. So I'm going to tell you you can't do it. We saw this happen as well with a very well-regarded news website called Deadspin. It was originally a sports website, then was kind of doing more social commentary and political work. And the owners, they bought it and then they shut it down and said, no, we don't want you guys talking about this stuff, so get rid of it. So if you don't like something, you can just go in and just buy the website if you've got enough money. So this is another way we're seeing this sort of inequality we talked about in the other lectures and a lot of the other reading rearing its head, where we essentially wind up with a two-tiered system, right? One set of laws for very wealthy people, one set of laws for everyone else. Now, if you're wealthy enough, you can just sue someone out of existence or just buy their company and get rid of them. And that means that we don't really have effective oversight. So the fact that the Cleveland Plain Dealer, or even locally, the Newark Star Ledger, has almost no one working there anymore, means that no one's watching local government. No one's telling us. We still have very good reporters in newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post. National newspapers are still doing very well and have lots of people working for them. So someone's keeping an eye on the national government. But who's keeping an eye on the state government? Who's keeping an eye on your local government? Again, as recently as 10 years ago, there would have been reporters at every town council meeting writing down what happened, investigating what's going on. And that simply doesn't exist anymore, meaning it's much easier potentially for governments to get away with corruption because really no one's watching. That's really a problem. It's a bigger problem when it comes to looking for corruption among very, very wealthy people. This is a source of power, right? Not people in government, but people like Peter Thiel, who are incredibly wealthy, have a lot of influence over the government, but we don't talk about them. And if you do talk about them, you write something they don't like, they could just sue you out of existence. And that gives them a lot of power, a lot of resistance. So we can't actually do much to check their power at this point, partially because of lawsuits and partially because of the power of capital. All right. That's all I want to talk about that. Thank you very much. And I will be posting questions for this soon. Thanks.